Elias Voss leaned back in his seat as the transport shuttle descended through the thick, swirling clouds of Viridia. The planet's dual suns cast a reddish-gold hue over the sprawling landscape, a sight that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. He had little time to appreciate it now. The tension between the human settlers and the Sarati natives was at a boiling point, and as the colony's most experienced diplomat, Elias was sent to douse the flames before they erupted into full-blown conflict. The shuttle jolted as it landed on the outskirts of the Sarati enclave. Elias adjusted his jacket, the weight of his authority as heavy as the look of distrust the Sarati warriors gave him as he stepped onto the platform. They were taller than humans, their lithe forms marked by bioluminescent patterns that pulsed faintly beneath their skin. Their sharp, angular features made it hard to read their emotions, but their stance was enough. They didn't want him there. Waiting for him at the edge of the platform was Kiri, her violet eyes locking onto him with a mixture of curiosity and annoyance. She was younger than he expected for someone in her position, a scientist tasked with bridging the gap between their species. Her bioluminescent markings flickered lightly, betraying an undercurrent of nervous energy. "You're late," she said without preamble, her voice smooth but clipped. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Storms aren't exactly on a schedule." Kiri's expression didn't change. "We must move quickly. The blooming season approaches, and the Enclave will not wait for you to adjust." The name alone was enough to make Elias uneasy. He'd been briefed about the bloom, an annual phenomenon that heightened the Sarathi's emotions and physical needs. It was a time of ritual bonding, something deeply private, yet unavoidable for those caught in its grasp. The thought of being here during such a time made his skin crawl, but orders were orders. "Lead the way," he said, gesturing for her to move. They walked in tense silence through the winding paths of the Sarati settlement. The architecture was a strange blend of organic and geometric, with buildings that seemed to grow out of the ground, their surfaces shimmering in the low light. The air was thick, both from the oncoming storm and the unspoken tension between the two of them. "We'll conduct our discussions in the neutral zone," Kiri said, her voice breaking the silence. "It's an ancient temple, far enough from the heart of the Enclave that the bloom's influence should be manageable." "Manageable?" Elias scoffed. "That's comforting." Kiri's eyes narrowed, but she said nothing more. As they approached the temple, the skies darkened, and the first rumbles of the storm echoed across the plains. The temple loomed ahead, its entrance flanked by massive pillars etched with glowing Sarati runes. They stepped inside just as the winds picked up, and the heavy stone doors groaned shut behind them, sealing out the storm. The air within the temple was cooler, almost oppressive. Elias scanned the room, taking in the intricate carvings and the faint hum of ancient energy. Kiri moved with purpose, activating a central console that lit up under her touch. "We'll conduct our discussions here," she said, her tone all business. "But first, we must ensure the storm doesn't damage the temple's systems." Elias nodded, stepping closer to inspect the console. Their hands brushed briefly as he reached for a set of controls, and both of them froze. It was a small touch, but the contact sent a ripple of unexpected heat through him. He glanced at her, and for a fleeting moment, he saw her composed exterior crack. Her markings flared faintly before she pulled her hand away. "Apologies," she muttered, turning her focus back to the console. Elias cleared his throat, brushing it off as nothing. But the tension in the air was undeniable now, thick and charged. They worked in silence, but every movement seemed more deliberate, every glance laden with unspoken thoughts. Hours passed, and the storm outside raged on. Elias found himself pacing the temple's central chamber while Kiri reviewed data from the Enclave. The isolation was starting to wear on him, and the growing warmth in the room was becoming harder to ignore. "This storm isn't letting up," he said, breaking the silence. "How long until it passes?" Kiri didn't look up from her work. "It could be hours, possibly longer." Elias sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Fantastic." Kiri finally turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "You should rest." The bloom's influence may affect you differently as a human, but you'll need your strength. I'm fine, Elias replied, though he could feel the weariness in his bones. Besides, I doubt I could sleep with everything going on. Kiri hesitated for a moment before stepping closer, her bioluminescent patterns dimming slightly. The bloom is not something that can be ignored. Even now, it's affecting you in ways you may not fully understand. Elias met her gaze, his voice low. I'll manage. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Very well. But if you feel overwhelmed, you must tell me. The weight of her words hung in the air as she turned back to her console. Elias sat down on one of the stone benches, his mind racing. He had faced countless tense negotiations, life or death situations, and the burden of leadership, but this felt different. There was an undercurrent of something primal here, something he couldn't fully control. As the hours dragged on, the tension between them grew. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, and the temple seemed to close in around them. Elias found his gaze drifting to Kiri more often than he cared to admit. The way her markings pulsed softly in the dim light, the quiet determination in her movements. It was mesmerizing in a way he hadn't anticipated. Kiri seemed to sense it too. She kept her distance, but her glances grew more frequent, her demeanor more guarded. The storm, the isolation, the bloom, it was all converging, drawing them into a delicate balance of restraint and inevitability. Finally, Kiri broke the silence. The bloom intensifies with each passing hour. If we are to endure this, we must trust each other. Elias stood, his eyes locked on hers. Trust isn't the issue, he said quietly. It's everything else. Kiri took a step closer, her voice soft but firm. Then we face it together. The storm outside roared, but within the temple, the tension between them reached its peak. Neither moved, the air between them heavy with unspoken truths. Whatever came next, they would have to confront it head-on, together. The storm outside continued to batter the ancient temple, its howling winds and relentless rain a constant reminder of their isolation. Inside, the tension between Elias and Kiri grew thicker with every passing moment. The faint hum of the temple's energy systems filled the silence as they worked side by side, their movements increasingly synchronized yet strained. Both tried to focus on their tasks, but the weight of the bloom pressed down on them, an invisible force that neither could fully ignore. Kiri's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the temple's central console, her bioluminescent markings flickering more erratically. She stole a glance at Elias, who stood a few feet away, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the encrypted messages on his datapad. His stoic demeanor hadn't wavered, but she could see the subtle signs of strain in the way he clenched his jaw and the tension in his shoulders. The bloom's effects will only intensify, Kiri said softly, breaking the silence. You must prepare yourself. Elias looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. You've mentioned that before. What exactly am I preparing for? Kiri hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the console. The bloom is not just a physical phenomenon. It amplifies emotions, heightens senses. It brings out desires that are difficult to suppress. Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering. And what happens if we can't suppress them? Kiri stepped closer, the dim light catching the intricate patterns on her skin. Then we must confront them, together. It's the only way to endure. For a moment, neither spoke. The unspoken tension between them crackled like static in the air. Elias could feel the weight of her words, the vulnerability in her tone. He nodded, breaking the momentary stillness. Let's get through the storm first. Then we'll figure out the rest. They returned to their tasks, but the atmosphere remained charged. Each time their hands brushed or their eyes met, a spark of electricity seemed to pass between them. It was as if the temple itself was conspiring to draw them closer, its ancient energy amplifying the effects of the bloom. As the hours passed, the storm outside grew fiercer. The temple trembled under the force of the winds, and a sudden, thunderous crash echoed through the chamber. Kiri's head snapped up, her eyes wide. The east corridor, she said, her voice tense. It must have collapsed. Elias grabbed his flashlight and followed her as she hurried toward the source of the sound. They navigated the dimly lit corridors, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls. When they reached the east wing, they found a massive pile of rubble blocking the passageway. Kiri placed a hand on the wall, her markings glowing faintly as she assessed the damage. "We're completely cut off from the outer sections of the temple. The only way out now is through the main chamber." Elias nodded, his mind already calculating their next steps. "We'll be fine as long as the central systems hold." They returned to the main chamber, but the atmosphere felt even heavier than before. The temple seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in as the storm raged on. Elias could feel the heat building in the air, the bloom's influence growing stronger with every passing minute. Kiri sat down on one of the stone benches, her breathing shallow. Her markings pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, casting a soft glow around her. Elias could see the strain on her face, the effort it took to maintain control. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "It's harder than I expected. The bloom, it's calling to me." Elias hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside her. He could feel the warmth radiating from her, the subtle pull of her presence. "What can I do to help?" Kiri's gaze softened, and she reached out, her fingers lightly grazing his hand. The touch was gentle but charged, sending a ripple of heat through him. "Just stay with me," she whispered. "We'll face this together." Elias nodded, his hand turning over to intertwine with hers. The contact was grounding, a silent reassurance that they weren't alone in this. For a while, they sat in silence, their breaths sinking as they focused on staying present. But the bloom's influence was relentless. The room seemed to grow warmer, the air thicker. Kiri's markings glowed brighter, and Elias could feel his own pulse quicken. He could no longer ignore the pull, the primal energy that urged him to close the distance between them. Kiri shifted, her other hand resting lightly on his forearm. "Elias," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "There's something I need to tell you." He turned to face her, their proximity narrowing until they were mere inches apart. "What is it?" She hesitated, her gaze searching his. "The bloom is not just about survival. It's about connection, trust. It forces us to confront our deepest selves, our desires and fears." Elias could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between her duty and the undeniable pull of the bloom. He reached up, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The gesture was instinctive, but it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. "I trust you," he said quietly. "Whatever happens, we'll get through this." Kiri's eyes shimmered, and for the first time, she allowed herself to lean into him. Their foreheads touched, and the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them and the steady rhythm of their breathing. The storm outside raged on, but within the temple, a fragile peace settled. It was a moment of quiet intimacy, a shared understanding that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And as the bloom's energy continued to build, they prepared for the trials yet to come. The dim glow of the temple's ancient carvings flickered softly, casting shifting patterns across the walls. Elias and Kiri sat together in the central chamber, their shared silence broken only by the distant rumble of the storm. Though they had spoken little since their earlier exchange, the space between them felt charged with a quiet intensity, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Elias could feel the weight of Kiri's presence beside him. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, a faint reflection of the energy coursing through her. He glanced at her, catching the subtle way her fingers tapped against her knee, a nervous habit she seemed unaware of. She was trying to stay composed, but the strain of the bloom was evident in every movement. "We can't ignore this forever," Kiri said finally, her voice low. "The bloom is relentless. It will push us to our limits." Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I know," he admitted, "but I'm not exactly an expert in dealing with this kind of situation." Kiri allowed a small, wry smile. "It's not something you can prepare for. Even among my people, the bloom tests everyone differently. She hesitated, then added, it forces us to face our instincts, to embrace or resist them. Elias felt the weight of her words settle over him. The bloom was more than a biological phenomenon. It was a crucible, designed to strip away pretense and expose raw truth. And in the confined space of the temple, there was no escape from its influence. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. So what happens now? Kiri met his gaze, her violet eyes steady. We find a way to endure. Together. The simplicity of her statement carried a profound weight. Elias nodded, feeling a sense of resolve settle within him. They had no choice but to confront the bloom head-on, trusting that their connection would carry them through. As the hours passed, the temple seemed to grow warmer, the air heavier. Elias could feel the heat rising beneath his skin, a restless energy that made it difficult to stay still. Kiri appeared similarly affected, her posture more rigid, her breathing shallow. The bloom was tightening its grip, and their fragile composure was beginning to fray. At one point, Kiri stood abruptly, pacing the length of the chamber. The energy in this place is amplifying everything, she said, her voice tinged with frustration. The temple was built to harness the bloom's power, but it's intensifying our connection to it. Elias rose, following her movements with his eyes. Is there any way to counteract it? To lessen its effects? Kiri shook her head. Not without leaving the temple, and the storm makes that impossible. We're trapped in the heart of the bloom's influence. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if drawn by an invisible force, Kiri stopped in front of Elias, her hands clenched at her sides. There is one way to stabilize the energy, she said quietly, but it requires synchronization. Elias frowned. Synchronization? Kiri nodded, her markings glowing faintly. It's a ritual designed to harmonize our physiological states. By aligning our energy, we can temper the bloom's intensity. Elias considered her words, recognizing the vulnerability in her tone. And how do we do that? Kiri took a step closer, her gaze steady but tinged with uncertainty. It's a deeply intimate process. We'll need to establish physical and emotional contact, complete trust. Elias felt a surge of tension, his heartbeat quickening. The prospect of such closeness was daunting, but he could see the sincerity in Kiri's expression. She was offering a solution, a way to endure the bloom together. He nodded slowly. If it helps us get through this, I'm willing to try. Kiri offered a small, reassuring smile. Thank you. We'll take it one step at a time. They moved to the center of the chamber, where the temple's energy pulsed more strongly. Kiri guided Elias through the initial steps of the ritual, her voice calm and measured. They stood facing each other, their hands lightly touching as they synchronized their breathing. Focus on the rhythm, Kiri instructed. Let your energy flow naturally. Elias closed his eyes, concentrating on the steady rise and fall of his breath. He could feel the subtle warmth of Kiri's touch, the way her presence seemed to anchor him. Gradually, their breathing aligned, their pulses falling into a shared cadence. As the synchronization deepened, Kiri stepped closer, her hands moving to rest lightly on Elias's arms. He opened his eyes, meeting her gaze. The connection between them felt almost tangible, a current of energy that flowed effortlessly from one to the other. Kiri's voice was barely above a whisper. We're in sync. Now we must maintain the connection. Elias nodded, his focus unwavering. The room seemed to fade around them, leaving only the shared rhythm of their bodies and the quiet intensity of their bond. Kiri's markings glowed brighter, their patterns shifting in time with their synchronized pulses. For a moment, the tension in the air eased, replaced by a sense of calm. Elias felt the restless energy within him begin to settle, the bloom's influence less oppressive. He could see the same relief mirrored in Kiri's expression. But the peace was short-lived. As the synchronization reached its peak, a surge of energy coursed through the temple, sending a ripple of heat through both of them. Kiri gasped, her hands tightening on Elias's arms. He instinctively stepped closer, his hands moving to her waist to steady her. The proximity brought them face to face, their breaths mingling in the charged air. Kiri's gaze flicked to his lips, then back to his eyes, her markings pulsing erratically. Elias could feel the tension between them building again, the pull of the bloom stronger than ever. "Kiri," he murmured, his voice rough. She didn't respond, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. Slowly, hesitantly, she leaned in, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, a delicate brush that quickly deepened as the weight of their shared emotions spilled over. The kiss was both a release and a reaffirmation, a way of grounding themselves in the midst of the bloom's chaos. For a moment, the storm outside and the temple's oppressive energy faded away, leaving only the warmth of their connection. When they finally pulled apart, Kiri's markings pulsed softly, her expression a mix of relief and lingering tension. Elias exhaled slowly, his hands still resting on her waist. "We're in this together," he said, his voice steady. Kiri nodded, her gaze unwavering. Together. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up, but within the temple, they had found a fragile equilibrium. Now, they would have to hold onto it as the bloom continued to test their limits. The storm raged on through the night, its relentless fury hammering against the ancient walls of the temple. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the lingering effects of the bloom. The synchronization ritual had brought Elias and Kiri some relief, but it had also drawn them closer in ways neither of them could fully articulate. The connection they now shared was undeniable, and the weight of it settled heavily between them. Elias leaned against one of the stone pillars, his arms crossed as he watched Kiri pace the room. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed softly, their light reflecting her internal struggle. He could tell she was trying to focus, to stay composed, but the strain was evident in her every movement. "We're managing," he said quietly, breaking the silence. "For now." Kiri stopped and turned to face him, her expression guarded. "Managing isn't enough," she replied. "The bloom will continue to push us. It's relentless." Elias nodded, his gaze steady. "Then we keep pushing back." Kiri sighed, her shoulders sagging slightly. She moved to sit on the stone bench opposite him, her hands resting in her lap. "You speak as if it's that simple," she said. "But you don't understand the full extent of what's coming." Elias frowned. "Then help me understand. Tell me what to expect." For a moment, Kiri was silent, her gaze fixed on the ground. Then she looked up, her violet eyes meeting his. "The bloom doesn't just amplify our emotions and physical needs," she said. "It forces us to confront our deepest vulnerabilities. It strips away the barriers we've built around ourselves, leaving us exposed." Elias considered her words, the weight of them sinking in. He had faced many challenges in his life, but this was something entirely different. The bloom wasn't just a test of endurance, it was a test of trust, of intimacy, of confronting the parts of himself he had long kept buried. "And you've been through this before?" he asked. Kiri nodded slowly. "Yes, but never like this. The intensity of the bloom varies, and being isolated in this temple only amplifies it. And," she hesitated, her markings flickering faintly, "I've never shared the bloom with a human before." Elias leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. "Neither have I," he said, a hint of wryness in his tone. "But we're here now. We'll figure it out together." Kiri offered a small, tentative smile, but the tension in her posture remained. She shifted slightly, her hands tightening in her lap. "There's more," she said quietly. "The synchronization we achieved earlier, it's only temporary. To maintain it, we'll need to deepen our connection." Elias felt a flicker of unease but kept his expression neutral. "What does that mean?" Kiri hesitated again, her gaze dropping. "It means we'll need to share more of ourselves. Our thoughts, our emotions, everything." Elias leaned back against the pillar, processing her words. He had always prided himself on his ability to keep his emotions in check, to compartmentalize. The idea of opening himself up so completely was daunting. But as he looked at Kiri, he saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet strength she carried despite the weight of the bloom. She was asking for his trust, and he knew he couldn't hold back. "All right," he said finally. "What do we need to do?" Kiri's markings glowed faintly, her relief evident. She stood and moved toward him, her steps measured and deliberate. "The temple's energy can help us," she said. "It will guide us through the process." She reached out, her hand hovering just above his. Elias hesitated for only a moment before taking her hand in his. The warmth of her touch was familiar now, but it still sent a subtle ripple of energy through him. Kiri led him to the center of the chamber, where the temple's energy pulsed strongest. "Close your eyes," she instructed softly. "Focus on your breathing." Elias complied, letting his eyes drift shut. He felt Kiri's presence beside him, her steady breathing syncing with his own. The air around them seemed to hum with a quiet intensity, the temple's energy wrapping around them like a cocoon. "Now," Kiri said, her voice barely above a whisper, "let your mind open. Let go of control." Elias took a deep breath, willing himself to release the tension he carried. As he did, he felt a strange sensation like a thread of energy connecting him to Kiri. It was subtle at first, a gentle tug at the edges of his consciousness. But as he leaned into it, the connection grew stronger, more vivid. Images flickered through his mind, glimpses of memories and emotions that weren't his own. He saw flashes of Kiri's life, moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. He felt her strength, her determination, but also her fear and doubt. It was an intimate, almost overwhelming glimpse into her soul. And then, he felt her presence in his own mind, exploring the depths of his memories. He sensed her curiosity, her empathy, as she navigated the complexities of his past. It was disorienting, but also strangely comforting. For the first time in years, Elias felt truly seen, his walls stripped away without judgment. The connection deepened, their shared energy flowing seamlessly between them. Elias felt his heartbeat slow, his breathing steady as the bloom's influence receded slightly. The intensity of the moment was profound, but it was also grounding. They were no longer two individuals navigating the storm alone. They were a unified force, stronger together. When they finally opened their eyes, the chamber seemed brighter. The oppressive weight of the bloom lessened. Kiri's markings pulsed softly, their rhythm in sync with Elias's heartbeat. "We did it," Kiri said, her voice filled with quiet awe. Elias nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We're not through it yet," he said, "but this is a good start." Kiri smiled back, her expression filled with a mix of relief and determination. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the temple, they had found a fragile balance. Together, they would face whatever came next. The storm outside showed no signs of relenting, its violent winds and sheets of rain battering the temple's stone walls. Inside, the atmosphere was deceptively calm, though the tension between Elias and Kiri remained palpable. The synchronization ritual had brought them a brief reprieve, a fragile balance that allowed them to endure the bloom's relentless pull. But both of them knew that the respite was temporary. Elias stood near the central console, reviewing the temple status on his datapad. The ancient structure was holding up, but the storm had damaged several key systems. He frowned, his fingers moving quickly over the screen as he tried to prioritize repairs. The last thing they needed was for the temple's power to fail while they were still trapped inside. Kiri was across the room, her focus on a small holographic display she had activated. Her markings pulsed faintly, a soft glow that reflected her concentration. She was analyzing the energy patterns within the temple, searching for any signs of instability. Despite the calm facade she maintained, Elias could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were slightly hunched as if bracing for an unseen impact. "You're worried," Elias said, breaking the silence. Kiri glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "The storm is stronger than anticipated," she replied. "If it continues at this intensity, the temple systems may not hold." Elias nodded, his gaze returning to his datapad. "I've reinforced the power grid in the central chamber," he said. "It should buy us some time." Kiri didn't respond immediately, her attention returning to the display. After a moment, she sighed and deactivated the hologram. "Time is something we don't have much of," she said quietly. Elias set the datapad aside and crossed the room to stand beside her. "We've made it this far," he said, his voice steady. "We'll get through the rest." Kiri looked up at him, her violet eyes searching his face. "You're confident," she said, a hint of wryness in her tone. "It's reassuring." Elias offered a small smile. "It's not confidence," he admitted. "It's stubbornness." Kiri's lips curved into a faint smile, but the moment was interrupted by a sudden, low rumble that echoed through the chamber. Both of them tensed, their eyes snapping toward the source of the sound. The ground beneath their feet vibrated slightly, and the temple's lights flickered. Elias instinctively reached for his sidearm, his senses on high alert. "What was that?" he asked, his voice sharp. Kiri moved quickly to the central console, her fingers flying over the controls. "It's coming from the lower levels," she said, her markings flaring brighter. "The temple's defense systems have been activated." Elias frowned, his grip tightening on his weapon. "Defense systems? Against what?" Kiri's expression darkened. "The temple was designed to protect its inhabitants during the bloom," she explained. "But the storm's energy surge must have triggered the systems. They'll perceive any living being as a potential threat." Elias cursed under his breath. "How do we shut them down?" Kiri worked frantically at the console, her focus unwavering. "I'm trying to override the system," she said, "but it's not responding. We'll need to access the control hub directly." Elias nodded, his mind already calculating their next move. "Where is it?" "Through the eastern passage," Kiri said, her gaze flicking toward the corridor. "But the path may be unstable." Elias tightened his grip on his sidearm. "We don't have a choice," he said. "Let's move." They navigated the darkened corridors of the temple, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone walls. The tension between them was palpable, a shared determination that kept them moving forward. As they approached the eastern passage, the air grew noticeably warmer, the bloom's influence intensifying with each step. Kiri led the way, her markings casting a faint glow that illuminated their path. Elias followed closely, his weapon at the ready. The passageway was narrow, the walls lined with intricate carvings that pulsed faintly with energy. The hum of the temple systems grew louder as they neared the control hub. Suddenly, a low, mechanical growl echoed through the corridor, followed by the sound of something heavy moving in the darkness. Elias raised his weapon, his body tensing. "We're not alone," he said. Kiri's markings flared brighter, her gaze scanning the shadows ahead. "The defense units are active," she said. "We need to move quickly." They pressed forward, their pace quickening as the sounds of the temple's defense mechanisms grew closer. As they turned a corner, a massive, hulking figure emerged from the shadows, its metallic form glowing with the temple's energy. The defense unit was an imposing construct, its limbs adorned with sharp, glowing blades. Elias didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon and fired, the plasma bolt striking the unit's torso. The construct staggered but quickly recovered, advancing toward them with alarming speed. "Kiri, get to the control hub," Elias shouted. "I'll hold it off." Kiri hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Be careful," she said, her voice laced with urgency. She sprinted toward the control hub, her markings flaring brighter as she channeled the temple's energy to aid her movement. Elias focused on the defense unit, firing rapidly as it closed the distance between them. Each shot slowed its advance, but the construct was relentless. Elias ducked as the unit's blade-like limb swung toward him, narrowly avoiding the strike. He rolled to the side and fired again, aiming for its joints. The construct faltered, its movements becoming more erratic. "Kiri, now would be a good time," Elias called out, his voice strained. In the distance, he heard the hum of the control hub as Kiri worked frantically to disable the system. The defense unit lunged at Elias again, its glowing blades slicing through the air. He dodged, his heart pounding as he fired a final shot that struck the unit's core. The construct convulsed, its energy surging wildly before it collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud. Elias exhaled sharply, his weapon still trained on the inert form. The corridor fell silent, save for the faint hum of the temple's systems. A moment later, Kiri's voice echoed through the passage. "I've shut it down," she called. "The defense systems are offline." Elias lowered his weapon, his body relaxing slightly. He made his way toward the control hub, where Kiri was leaning against the console, her markings dimming as she caught her breath. "You did it," Elias said, his voice filled with quiet relief. Kiri nodded, her expression weary but determined. "We did it," she corrected. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared ordeal settling over them. The Bloom's influence still lingered, but for now, they had bought themselves some time. Together, they would face whatever came next. The quiet hum of the temple's energy systems returned to a steady rhythm, marking the end of the immediate danger. The defense systems had been deactivated, but the tension lingering in the air suggested their ordeal was far from over. Elias stood near the collapsed defense unit, his breathing steadying as he holstered his weapon. He glanced toward the control hub, where Kiri remained focused on the console. She was meticulously reviewing the temple systems, her bioluminescent markings pulsing faintly as she worked. The light from the console bathed her face, highlighting the determined set of her jaw. Elias approached, his footsteps echoing softly in the chamber. "How bad is it?" he asked. Kiri's fingers paused briefly on the controls before she turned to face him. "The defense systems are stable for now," she said, "but the storm has caused significant damage to the temple's core. If we can't stabilize it, the entire structure could collapse." Elias exhaled, his gaze shifting to the console's display. "And how do we stabilize it?" Kiri hesitated, her eyes searching his face. "There's a failsafe system in the central chamber," she explained. "It requires two synchronized users to channel their energy into the core." Elias raised an eyebrow. "Synchronized like before?" Kiri nodded, her expression serious. "Yes, but this time the connection will need to be deeper. The temple's core feeds on emotional and physical harmony. We'll have to maintain the synchronization for as long as it takes to stabilize the system." Elias met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "And what happens if we fail?" Kiri's markings dimmed slightly. "If we fail, the temple will collapse, and the energy release could destroy everything within a several-mile radius." The weight of her words settled heavily between them. Elias could see the worry in her eyes, but beneath it, he also saw a quiet resolve. She was prepared to face whatever came next, no matter the cost. "Then we don't fail," Elias said firmly. "Let's get it done." Kiri nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing her face. She led the way back to the central chamber, her pace quick but measured. Elias followed closely, his mind racing through the implications of what they were about to do. The synchronization ritual had been intense enough before. Now they were being asked to push even further, to forge a connection that went beyond anything he had experienced. They reached the center of the chamber, where the temple's core pulsed faintly beneath the floor. Kiri knelt beside the central console, activating a series of controls that caused the core to glow brighter. The air around them grew warmer, the Bloom's influence thickening once more. "We'll begin the synchronization here," Kiri said, her voice calm despite the tension in the room. "Once the connection is established, we'll direct our combined energy into the core." Elias nodded, moving to stand opposite her. He could feel the steady hum of the temple beneath his feet, a reminder of the ancient power they were about to channel. Kiri extended her hands toward him, her gaze steady. "Are you ready?" she asked. Elias hesitated for only a moment before taking her hands in his. "Ready." The connection between them sparked immediately, a surge of warmth and energy that flowed effortlessly from one to the other. Their breathing synchronized, their pulses aligning as they had before. But this time, the connection went deeper, drawing them into a shared space that transcended physical boundaries. Elias felt a flood of emotions and memories that weren't his own, glimpses of Kiri's life, her struggles, her hopes. He saw the weight of her responsibilities, the fear she carried of failing her people. At the same time, he felt her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering determination to protect those she cared about. Kiri, in turn, experienced Elias's memories. She saw the battles he had fought, the losses he had endured, and the burden of leadership that had shaped him. She felt his resolve, his quiet strength, and the depth of his commitment to those under his care. The connection between them deepened, forging a bond built on mutual understanding and trust. As their synchronization reached its peak, Kiri guided Elias through the final steps of the ritual. Together, they directed their combined energy toward the core, their focus unshakable. The core's light intensified, its pulsing rhythm syncing perfectly with their own. The air around them grew heavier, the bloom's influence pressing down on them with increasing intensity. Elias could feel the strain, the weight of the energy they were channeling. But he also felt the steady presence of Kiri, her strength bolstering his own. "We're almost there," Kiri said, her voice steady despite the effort it took to speak. "Stay with me." Elias nodded, his grip on her hands tightening slightly. "I'm not going anywhere." The core's light continued to grow, its energy building to a crescendo. The chamber around them seemed to blur, the boundaries between their individual selves dissolving completely. For a moment they were one, a single, unified force driven by a shared purpose. Then, with a final surge of energy, the core stabilized. The light dimmed to a steady glow, and the oppressive weight of the bloom began to lift. The air grew cooler, the tension in the room easing as the temple systems returned to normal. Elias and Kiri slowly released their grip on each other, their breathing heavy but steady. The connection between them lingered, a quiet hum that reminded them of the bond they had forged. "It's done," Kiri said softly, her markings glowing faintly in the dim light. "The temple is stable." Elias nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "We did it." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experience settling over them. The storm outside had begun to weaken, its once fierce winds now reduced to a steady rain. The danger had passed, but the connection they had formed would remain. Kiri offered a small, tired smile. "You're a stubborn man, Elias Voss." Elias chuckled, his expression softening. "And you're as fierce as they come, Kiri." Their shared laughter echoed softly through the chamber, a quiet acknowledgement of the trials they had faced together. As they prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, they knew they would do so as a united force, stronger together than they had ever been alone. The storm had finally subsided, leaving behind a world cloaked in a serene stillness. Outside the temple, the twin suns of Viridia began to pierce through the heavy clouds, casting soft, golden light over the drenched landscape. Inside, the air was lighter, the oppressive weight of the bloom diminished, though its lingering effects were still palpable. The once chaotic hum of the temple systems had steadied into a rhythmic pulse, matching the calm that had settled between Elias and Kiri. Elias stood at the temple's entrance, his eyes scanning the horizon. The storm's fury had left its mark. Scattered debris, toppled trees, and deep gouges in the earth. Yet there was a quiet beauty in the aftermath, a reminder of nature's resilience. He took a deep breath, savoring the cool, fresh air, and let his thoughts wander. Behind him, Kiri approached silently. Her bioluminescent markings glowed faintly in the softened light, a reflection of her calmer state. She stopped a few steps away, watching Elias with an unreadable expression. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said softly. "How quickly everything can change." Elias turned, his gaze meeting hers. "Storms pass," he replied, "but they leave a lasting impact." Kiri nodded, stepping closer. "And so do the choices we make during them." There was a weight to her words, one that Elias understood all too well. The bond they had forged in the temple was unlike anything he had experienced. It was a connection born of necessity, but it had grown into something far deeper. Now, as they stood on the edge of a world returning to normalcy, The reality of what that connection meant loomed large. "We'll be returning to the settlement soon," Kiri said after a moment. "The Enclave will be eager to hear what we've discovered here." Elias crossed his arms, leaning slightly against the stone wall. "And they'll have questions," he said, his tone measured. "About us." Kiri's markings pulsed slightly brighter, a subtle reflection of her inner conflict. "The bond we formed isn't something easily explained," she admitted, "especially to those who don't understand the bloom." Elias nodded. "They'll see it as a complication, something that challenges the fragile balance between our people." Kiri's gaze softened. "It is a challenge," she said, "but it's also a bridge, a way forward." Elias considered her words, the quiet conviction in her voice. She was right. What they had endured together, what they had built, was more than just a survival tactic. It was a testament to the potential for unity between their species. Yet, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. "Not everyone will see it that way," he said. "There will be resistance." Kiri stepped closer, her hand lightly brushing against his arm. The touch was gentle but grounding, a reminder of the trust they had built. "Then we'll face it together," she said. "One step at a time." Elias allowed himself a small smile. "You make it sound simple." Kiri tilted her head, her markings flickering with a hint of amusement. "It's never simple," she said. "But that doesn't mean it isn't worth it." Their shared moment of quiet understanding was interrupted by the faint hum of a distant engine. Elias turned toward the sound, his sharp eyes catching the glint of a shuttle approaching from the settlement. The rescue team had finally arrived. "It's time," Kiri said, her voice steady but tinged with anticipation. Elias nodded, pushing off the wall. Together, they moved toward the temple's entrance, their steps in sync. As they emerged into the open air, the shuttle descended, its engines kicking up a gentle whirlwind that ruffled their hair and clothes. The shuttle's door hissed open, and a small group of humans and Scifi stepped out, their expressions a mix of relief and curiosity. Among them was Commander Rena, a no-nonsense human officer who had worked closely with Elias in the past. She approached quickly, her sharp eyes scanning him for injuries. "Voss," she said, her tone brisk but tinged with concern. "You look like hell." Elias smirked. "Good to see you too, Rena." Rena's gaze shifted to Kiri, her expression unreadable. "And you must be Kiri," she said, her voice neutral. "The Enclave has been worried about your safety." Kiri inclined her head. "The storm was worse than expected," she said. "But we've secured the temple." Rena's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "We'll debrief back at the settlement," she said. "There's a lot we need to discuss." Elias and Kiri exchanged a brief glance before following the rescue team onto the shuttle. The ride back to the settlement was quiet, the hum of the engines filling the space. Elias could feel the weight of the coming conversations pressing down on him, but he kept his focus on the path ahead. When they arrived at the settlement, they were met with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Humans and Scifi alike gathered to watch as Elias and Kiri disembarked, their whispers carrying on the wind. The bond between the two of them was invisible, but its presence was palpable, a subtle shift in the air that did not go unnoticed. They were led to a secure briefing room, where representatives from both sides awaited. The room was austere, its plain walls and functional furniture emphasizing the seriousness of the meeting. Elias and Kiri took their places at the center of the table, their composure steady despite the scrutiny. Rena stood at the head of the table, her sharp gaze moving between the two of them. "Let's begin," she said, her voice firm. "What happened in the temple?" Elias and Kiri recounted the events in detail, from the storm's onset to the activation of the temple's defense systems. They explained the synchronization ritual and how it had allowed them to stabilize the core, carefully omitting the more intimate aspects of their connection. As they spoke, the room remained silent, the weight of their words sinking in. When they finished, Rena leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "You're telling us that the bloom forced a bond between you," she said, her tone measured. "A bond that allowed you to harness the temple's energy." Kiri met her gaze evenly. Yes, she said. And it's a bond that goes beyond survival. It's a foundation for understanding and cooperation. Rena's expression remained stoic, but Elias could see the gears turning in her mind. She was calculating the implications, weighing the risks and benefits. Your actions saved the temple, Rena said finally. But this bond of yours, it complicates things. Elias nodded, his voice steady. Complications can lead to progress, he said, if we're willing to embrace them. The room fell silent again, the tension thick. But beneath it, there was a sense of possibility, a fragile but undeniable hope for a new path forward. The briefing room emptied slowly, the weight of the discussion leaving an uneasy tension in its wake. Representatives from both species filed out, some with tight expressions of skepticism, others with quiet contemplation. Elias and Kiri remained seated, the room now quiet except for the faint hum of the settlement's environmental controls. Elias leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. That could have gone worse, he said, though his tone was far from relaxed. Kiri's markings pulsed faintly as she folded her hands in front of her. There's still much to resolve, she replied. They won't accept our bond easily. Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway. The bond between him and Kiri had been critical in stabilizing the temple, yet its existence was now a point of contention. For some, it represented a dangerous blending of their species, a challenge to the fragile peace. For others, it was a potential bridge, an unprecedented opportunity for unity. The door opened again, and Commander Rena re-entered, her sharp eyes fixed on them. She moved with purpose, taking the seat at the head of the table once more. Both councils will deliberate on the situation, she said, her tone brisk. But there's another matter we need to address immediately. Elias straightened. What is it? Rena tapped a few keys on the console embedded in the table. A holographic map of the surrounding region flickered to life, displaying the temple, the settlement, and several outlying areas. One section pulsed with a red glow. We've intercepted communications from a rogue faction, Rena explained. They're planning to use the bloom and the storm's aftermath to incite conflict. Their goal is to undermine the peace talks and push for war. Kiri's expression darkened. The faction has long opposed cooperation between our people, she said. If they act now, they could shatter everything we've worked for. Renna nodded. Exactly. And based on their movements, they're planning to strike within the next 24 hours. Elias leaned forward, his mind already racing. What's the target? The temple, Rena said. They see it as a symbol of unity, and they know its destruction would escalate tensions. A heavy silence fell over the room. The temple, with its ancient power and cultural significance, had become a linchpin in the fragile balance between the two species. Its loss would be catastrophic. What's the plan? Elias asked, his voice steady. Rena's gaze shifted between him and Kiri. We need to intercept them before they reach the temple. A small, skilled team can move faster and operate more discreetly than a large force. Elias nodded, already knowing where this was going. You want us to lead the team? Rena's expression was grim. You're the most qualified. Your bond with Kiri gives you an advantage. They won't expect you to be operating in perfect sync. Kiri glanced at Elias, her markings pulsing faintly. We'll do it, she said, her voice resolute. But we'll need full access to the settlement's resources. Rena inclined her head. You'll have everything you need. I'll assemble the rest of the team and brief them. We leave at first light. With the plan set, Elias and Kiri left the briefing room to prepare. The settlement's corridors were quieter now, the earlier buzz of activity replaced by the heavy anticipation of what was to come. They moved in silence, their shared resolve evident in the way their steps fell in perfect rhythm. Once inside their quarters, Elias activated the console, pulling up schematics of the temple and its surrounding terrain. Kiri joined him, her focus sharpening as they reviewed the mission parameters. The rogue faction will likely use the old tunnels beneath the temple to avoid detection, Kiri said, tracing a path on the map with her finger. We'll need to block their access points and neutralize their leaders quickly. Elias nodded. We'll set traps at these choke points, he said, marking several locations. Force them into a bottleneck where we can control the fight. They worked seamlessly, their earlier synchronization carrying over into their planning. As the hours passed, their strategy took shape, each detail refined until they were confident in their approach. Finally, Kiri stepped back, her markings dimming slightly as she exhaled. It's a solid plan, she said, but it relies heavily on precision. One misstep. Elias placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We won't make one, he said firmly. We've come this far. We're not losing now. Kiri's gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight of the mission lifted. They stood in silence, the unspoken bond between them providing a quiet strength. Then, without warning, Kiri closed the distance between them, her hand brushing lightly against his cheek. Thank you, she said softly, for standing with me. Elias's hand covered hers, his touch warm and steady. We stand together, he said. Always. The gravity of their connection hung in the air, a reminder of the stakes they were fighting for. With a quiet determination, they resumed their preparations, readying themselves for the battle ahead. As dawn broke, the settlement stirred to life. The chosen team gathered at the edge of the perimeter, their expressions resolute. Rena briefed them quickly, her words sharp and efficient. When she finished, Elias and Kiri stepped forward, their presence commanding. Stay sharp, Elias said, his voice carrying over the group. We're walking into a dangerous situation, but we've got the advantage. Trust your training, trust each other, and we'll come out of this together. Kiri's markings flared briefly as she added, the temple is more than a structure. It's a symbol of what we can achieve together. Let's make sure it stands. With that, they set off, moving swiftly and silently across the terrain. The weight of the mission pressed down on them, but the bond between Elias and Kiri provided a steady anchor. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead, their unity a beacon of hope in the gathering storm. The air was tense as Elias and Kiri led their team through the winding paths toward the temple. The early morning light cast long shadows across the terrain, and the cool breeze carried the faint scent of rain lingering from the storm. Every step was measured, every movement deliberate, as they approached the site where the rogue faction was expected to strike. Elias scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes catching every detail. The terrain was rugged, scattered with jagged rocks and patches of dense foliage. It provided both cover and danger, a perfect setting for an ambush. He tightened his grip on his weapon, the weight of the mission settling heavily on his shoulders. Beside him, Kiri moved with quiet precision, her bioluminescent markings pulsing softly in time with her steady breathing. She kept her focus on the scanner in her hands, its glowing interface mapping out the underground tunnels beneath the temple. The device beeped faintly, signaling a cluster of life forms moving toward one of the hidden entrances. They're here, Kiri said, her voice low but clear. She pointed to a narrow ravine ahead. They're using the eastern tunnel. If they reach the core, they'll detonate the charges and collapse the entire structure. Elias nodded, signaling to the team. We'll cut them off at the bottleneck, he said. Move quietly. No unnecessary risks. The team spread out, their movements fluid and synchronized. They advanced toward the ravine, taking up positions along the rocky outcrops that flanked the entrance to the tunnel. The air grew still, the tension palpable as they prepared to engage. Kiri crouched beside Elias, her gaze fixed on the tunnel's shadowed mouth. Her markings glowed brighter, a subtle reflection of the adrenaline coursing through her. They'll have sentries posted, she said. We'll need to neutralize them quickly. Elias gave a brief nod, his hand brushing hers in a silent gesture of reassurance. We'll handle it, he said. Stay sharp. Minutes passed, the silence broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant calls of native wildlife. Then, the first figure emerged from the tunnel, a tall, armored Sarati carrying a pulse rifle. He moved with the practiced ease of a seasoned fighter, his sharp eyes scanning the terrain. Elias raised his weapon, waiting for the perfect moment. He caught the briefest flicker of movement as a second figure stepped into view, followed by a third. The sentries were spaced out, their formation tight but vulnerable in the narrow passage. "On my mark," Elias murmured into his calm, 3 targets. "Kiri, take the one on the left. Tanis, you've got the center. I'll handle the right." The team acknowledged in silence, their weapons trained on their respective targets. Elias watched the sentries' movements, his focus narrowing as he timed their steps. "Mark!" 3 shots rang out in quick succession, their precision flawless. The sentries dropped without a sound, their bodies crumpling into the underbrush. Elias gave a brief signal, and the team moved in to secure the tunnel entrance. As they advanced, the sound of footsteps echoed from within the tunnel, growing louder with each passing second. Elias and Kiri exchanged a quick glance, their silent communication clear. The main force was approaching. The team took up defensive positions, their weapons trained on the tunnel. The moment the first enemy emerged, a burst of coordinated fire erupted, driving the rogue fighters back. The narrow passage worked to their advantage, forcing the enemy into a choke point where they couldn't effectively maneuver. Elias moved with calculated precision, his shots finding their marks as he directed the team. Kiri was at his side, her own weapon firing in controlled bursts. Despite the chaos, they operated as a seamless unit, their bond guiding their actions. The battle was fierce but short-lived. The rogue faction, caught off guard by the ambush, quickly lost their momentum. As their numbers dwindled, the remaining fighters retreated deeper into the tunnel, abandoning their mission. Elias signaled the team to hold their positions. "They'll regroup if we give them the chance," he said. "We need to push them back and disable their explosives." Kiri nodded, her markings flickering with determination. "The core chamber is just ahead," she said. "If we can reach it before they do, we can neutralize the charges and secure the temple." The team advanced cautiously, their footsteps echoing softly in the confined space of the tunnel. The air grew cooler as they descended, the faint hum of the temple's energy systems growing louder. The walls were etched with ancient Scifi symbols, their glowing patterns a stark reminder of what was at stake. As they neared the core chamber, the tunnel widened into a vast, open space. The core itself pulsed at the center, a massive, glowing structure that radiated with a steady, rhythmic energy. Around it, several rogue fighters worked frantically to set the charges, their attention divided between their task and the sounds of the approaching team. Elias didn't hesitate. "Go loud," he ordered, and the team moved in with precision and force. The chamber erupted into chaos as the 2 sides clashed. Pulse fire lit the dim space, casting stark shadows across the walls. The rogue fighters fought desperately, but they were no match for the team's coordinated assault. Elias and Kiri pushed forward, their focus on the core. As they reached the central console, Kiri quickly began disabling the explosives, her fingers flying over the controls. "Cover me," she said, her voice steady despite the urgency. Elias positioned himself between her and the remaining fighters, his weapon firing in controlled bursts. The rogue faction was rapidly losing ground, their numbers dwindling as the team pressed their advantage. "Explosives disarmed," Kiri announced moments later. "The core is secure." Elias gave a brief nod, his focus shifting to the last of the rogue fighters. Within minutes, the chamber fell silent, the enemy either neutralized or retreating into the depths of the tunnel. The team regrouped around the core, their expressions a mix of relief and exhaustion. Elias lowered his weapon, his gaze meeting Kiri's. She gave him a small, tired smile, her markings dimming slightly as the tension began to ease. "It's over," she said softly. Elias nodded, his own relief tempered by the knowledge of what they had accomplished. "For now," he said, "but we've sent a message today. The temple stands, and so does our unity." The team's quiet victory was a testament to their strength and resolve. Together, they had faced the storm and emerged stronger, their bond a beacon of hope for the future. As they prepared to return to the settlement, Elias and Kiri knew that their journey was far from over, but they would face whatever came next, side by side.